You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 95 Podcast. My name is Caralee Culpepper, and I have John Sanders with me again today, one of the coaches for our 95 Network team. And John, we have some interesting content for everybody today.
Man, Caralee, I cannot wait to get to our guest today. We've got a phenomenal conversation. Can I just put a disclaimer on this right up front? Mm-hmm. We're going to say some things and cover some things today that maybe not everyone in our audience is going to like to hear, but it's really important. And this is a powerful message that the church needs in this hour. So put on your seatbelt. We'll get a little bumpy, but we're going to have a great conversation today.
Well, we are here with David Murrow. He has written the book, Why Men Hate Going to Church. And David, I would love for you to just give us a little a little summary of what this book is about. Obviously, the title says a lot.
Yes. Well, people are amazed to even hear that men hate going to church because there's a perception that church is male dominated. And if you're talking about the relatively thin stratum of professional clergy, then yes, the church is male dominated, but the pews belong to women. In fact, there was an author who said famously that the church is actually an army of women led by a few male generals. So the statistic that I like to quote is that the average church in North America draws an adult crowd that is 61% female and 39% male. So, and then I challenge people, go to church next Sunday and count noses. And if your church is typical, 6 out of 10 of those noses will have lipstick underneath.
That is interesting, though. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a perception among men in the West that religion is something for women and children. It's something that makes you softer, more gentler, more. Also, I do this little test whenever I speak to a group. I'll put 2 sets of values up on the screen, and then I'll say which set best represents the values of Jesus and his true followers. And the first set is love, communication, beauty, relationships, support, help, nurturing, feelings, harmony, these sorts of things. And then the second set is goal setting, boldness, aggression, these sorts of things. And whenever I ask people to identify the values of Jesus, they're always more comfortable with the first set than the second. And then I tell them where these values come from. They're from chapter 2 of the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And so we are always more comfortable assigning women's values, Venus values to Jesus. When we think of Jesus, we tend to think of the values that come more naturally to women and are a little more difficult for men to embrace. So we have this perception that to be a Christian is to be somewhat less manly. And then you compare this to other religions such as Islam, where the manliest man is the one who is the most religious. Religion and manly behaviors such as self-sacrifice, even fighting, war, are deeply entwined in that tradition. So the men pay less of a social price to be religious in Islamic societies than they do in Christian societies.
Okay, so I want to jump in with a quick question here, David. Why does this even matter to the audience that may be listening to this saying, so what? That we have churches that are predominantly lean much more in the female direction and makeup than the masculine and the men. Why does it matter if we don't have men in churches?
A couple of reasons. First of all, there's a very strong statistical correlation between church decline and the departure of men. I'm predicting, or a lot of church futurists are predicting anywhere from 50 to 100,000 churches are going to disappear, close their doors in the next 15 years. And almost every one of them has something in common, is that there was a withdrawal of men about 20 years ago. The women have stayed because it's their social network, it's their friends. But without the presence of men, they've been unable to turn their fortunes around. The other reasons are simply, the church it's not a one-winged bird. You need both men and women. You need both of their gifts. And one of the things we find is in the fast-growing churches, there's almost always a strong presence of men. Most church planters are men. Most churches start out with built around what are seen as stereotypically male values. the need for aggressive evangelism, strong outreach, almost a conquest mentality, if you were. Whereas the older churches tend to focus on, relationships and caring and nurturing, things that women are better at, but that will eventually doom a church because they de-emphasize outreach and, going out and getting people and, convincing people of their sin and these sorts of things. So long answer to your short question is there's a very strong correlation between the presence of men and church vitality. And the withdrawal of men usually leads to a loss of membership and also a loss of orthodoxy. There tends to be, churches tend to liberalize as the men leave.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I have a maxim. In general, women will sacrifice rules on the altar of relationships, whereas men will sacrifice relationships on the altar of rules. And so what happens is, as a church gets older and there's a need to accommodate people's theological views, women will say, we need to preserve the relationships, and they will make a little compromise here. Whereas men will say, no, look at this book called the Bible. Here's the rule, right? So, both are trying to do a noble thing. The women are trying to keep the family of God together. The men are trying to preserve the fidelity to the scriptures. And again, these are huge generalities. There are plenty of very faithful Orthodox women, and there are men who are willing to compromise on the rules. But what I'm saying is, in general, if you're looking at the entire population, if you look at the denominations where women have taken the strongest leadership roles, such as the Episcopal Church, the Mainline Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, there has been a departure from traditional interpretations of Christian orthodoxy in order to make everyone feel loved and accepted. I see that as sort of a feminization. The church is a blanket, it is here to comfort, rather than a rule book that is designed to make us grow straighter.
Yeah.
And, you need both. Jesus was all about grace, but he also embraced the law. And when a church when it loses its men, it tends to lose a lot of its, it just becomes more of a comforting blanket. And, young men want nothing to do with it. The church eventually dies.
Yeah. Wow. Now, how many years has it been since this book has been out? I mean, it was years ago in my ministry when I found it. It was early in my ministry when I found your book, and it made a huge impact. By the way, maybe I'll just take this moment to thank you publicly for that, because one of the greatest compliments that I would get over the years in ministry is when a woman would come to me and say, for years, I was never able to get my husband to come to church. He wanted nothing to do with it. But when we found this church, it's different. He leads us here. He likes coming to church here. And I credit your book and a few others largely with really helping me shape that or maybe set that thermostat in the direction of, we want a church that is unapologetically welcoming to that masculine spirit. And it's not an anti-feminine spirit. It's not that we don't want women in our church or somehow this boys rule, girls drool type of a thing. It's, we need men in the church. And so, but it's been a long time. I have a place I'm going with this question. How many years ago was it that you released this book, David?
The original version came out in 2005, and then we did a revision in 2011.
Okay. And that's kind of where I'm going with my question is there such a thing as a Why Men Hate Going to Church 2.0, specifically in our culture today, where to even broach the subject of gender at all, you're stepping into a hornet's nest where our culture wants to tell us there is no such thing as feminine, qualities or masculine qualities, as if there's no difference between men and women. You just pick whatever you want to be. Like, have you gotten questions about your message in these, more recent days as our culture is dealing with things that we weren't really wrestling with as publicly back when you wrote the book?
Well, I did just get canceled.
Nice.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, my first cancellation. I'm not going to name the church. They were very gracious. They paid my speaker fee, despite the fact that I didn't come. But yeah, the most disturbing trend that I see is in some churches, there are women, certainly not all the women, but there is a cadre of women who do not want to hear men's perspectives on things. They see them as toxic, as oppressive to women, as and I'm just thinking about these women. Do you guys have boys? Are you raising sons? I mean,
I have a son.
The church that you were trying to create, that's constantly just squelching men's hearts. Is that really what you want for your boys? I mean, are you going to be surprised when your sons don't want to attend that when they, are 12, 13, 14? Be careful what you wish for. That's been the biggest pushback that I have seen, is that, especially coming out of the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement, there's been a minority, certainly the minority, but a very touchy women who are trying to recast the church and move it even further away from the things that would attract men or would be of interest to men. And I think that's a big mistake.
What would you say is something that attracts men to a church?
Well, like Jon was saying, I have a zillion examples. Here in my church here in Anchorage, Alaska. I mean, Alaska, men are men, right? Hunt, fish, fly airplanes, kill bears in the front yard. I mean, this is a macho place. And so we work very hard to create a healthy masculine spirit, not one that oppresses women or, woman under my thumb, none of that stuff. But we just speak to men. The music pastor will get up there and he'll talk about going hunting. Or there's a woman that we have in our church who prayed for her husband for 15 years to come to church. He wouldn't come. One Sunday, he finally came. And our pastor got up there and he used a bow and arrow as a sermon illustration. He actually had a target up on stage and he fired this arrow into the target. He was talking about the Greek word hamartia, sin. To miss sin is actually an archery term, to miss the mark. Well, it turns out that her husband had done archery in high school, was fascinated by this sermon. He's now an elder in our church. It was just an example of doing something that would be of interest to men. Now, it's not like the women ran out of the thing, oh, he used a bow and arrow. The women loved it too, There's so much that we can do that welcomes the men that women also find quite interesting. But whereas if we put a feminine gloss on the gospel, we tend to disinterest the men. One of the examples that I like to give when I'm teaching pastors is that term, personal relationship with Jesus Christ. How many times does that appear in the Bible?
0, I'm pretty sure.
Never once is our walk with God described as a relationship. But it has become the number one metaphor we use for Christian discipleship. And the reason is because we are targeting women, and women put relationships first. So when they understand our mission for God as a passionate, intimate relationship with a man who's crazy about you, we are really explaining the gospel in terms that is going to warm the heart of a woman, but leave a man thinking, okay, maybe I'll go play golf.
Yeah.
So there's any number of ways that we kind of subtly tell men that this is a feminine enterprise. And, the good thing about women is women love men's things, but men are utterly uninterested in women's things. So if we put a more masculine gloss on things, women will definitely think, wow, that was cool. And not just because their men like it, because they like it too.
I don't know. Jon does watch those cooking shows.
Well, it's not that I don't watch cooking shows.
I'm sorry, cooking TikToks, right?
I do, get arrested, but it's for cooking at the fire station, which is kind of a masculine thing. But
men like to eat,
Yes. David, what I would say is this: when I was leading my church and in that lead pastor role, as I mentioned a minute ago, I unapologetically would tell our team and our leaders, if we have a thermostat with, strong masculine on one side and strong feminine on the other, without apology, I want that thermostat to tip in the direction of the masculine. I want this to be an environment where men feel comfortable, where a normal masculine average guy who doesn't know the Lord, construction worker, farmer, walks in and looks around and goes, okay, I'm comfortable here. So what does that mean? Practically speaking, we don't have a lot of floral arrangements on purpose, not because I hate flowers, but we're trying to create an environment that doesn't feel super girly. Go ahead, speak to that.
And decor is one of the very easiest things that you can do. When you walk into many churches, it has what I call the grandma's parlor motif. There is a lace doily on the communion table, fresh flowers, quilts, banners. There are in the hallway, there are classroom style construction paper things with yarn. And It just looks like it was decorated by a woman. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, but when a young man walks in there, it's going to send a strong message to him that he's gone back to school or that he's at his grandma's house. And so the churches that attract men tend to do a much more gender neutral vibe, or they will even decorate intentionally toward masculine. I know of one church that took down the felt quilted banners out of the sanctuary, and they mounted animal heads.
Yes.
Mounts, that hunters had taken. They repainted they already had a beautiful wooden tongue and groove ceiling. So they refitted their sanctuary as a hunting lodge, around a hunting lodge motif with river rock and these mounted animal heads. And every once in a while, somebody would come in and they'd say, wow, what happened to the flowers or to the quilts and banners? And the pastor's answer was always, well, there's no quilts in the Bible, but there's plenty of dead animals.
Well, in all seriousness, David, one of my coaching clients, and I'm going to give him a shout out here, Jordan Wilson, is the pastor of Church in the Country in Woodville, Texas. And it's exactly what you just described. You walk into their lobby, and I describe it as like going to a church in a Bass Pro Shop. I mean, it's very well done, but it's an environment that a normal guy would walk in and look around and go, this fits. I feel comfortable here. And again, I don't think it's repelling too many women. I think the women are just as comfortable there.
We have a woman on the call, so why don't we ask her?
Yeah,
Caralee, if you walked into a church and you saw mounts and fishing gear and camping gear and stuff on the walls, what would that communicate to you?
I don't know. Transparently, I'm not sure I would dig it, to be completely honest. I think that just being totally honest, I don't know. I guess I'm sitting here thinking I wish there's a good balance that could be struck, I get why, the doilies and the flowers, but I also kind of don't know that I would love the woodsy kind of look. I'm not sure. And not that I would really care. I think, for me at this point in my life, I'm really more concerned with what, the pastors are preaching about, what the theology is, what the church stands for, things like that. But I know that not everybody is at that place. So I guess there's, you have to consider a lot of it, the audience as a whole.
And remember, we're talking about first impressions here. So
yes.
If a man walks into a church and is properly decorated and the sermon stinks, he's not going to stay.
Right.
The most important thing is it's going to be the quality of the preaching and whether the song isn't repeated 11 times and, those sorts of things. He's looking for an overall good experience. But when we talk about decor, we're just talking about that first impression. When a man walks in, he needs to feel like this is a place that understands him and is not just a place for his wife and kids.
Yeah, I can see the value in that for sure. Jon, I think I maybe would like your idea more of the neutral tilting towards the masculine.
Yeah, and I was going to say that, Caralee, there is a balance, like what you had said. We didn't have any dead animals hanging in our building, although I wish we would have now. But I get what you're saying. And I want the rest of our audience to know this doesn't mean, Pastor, that you have to become this macho, go buy a pickup truck and start chewing tobacco and spit and scratch and stuff. It's not what we're saying. It's just giving consideration to the masculine that I believe David hit the nail on the head with this book, that oftentimes the church is overlooking that, and for good reason, right, David? It's the women are the ones raising their hands, stepping up and serving and volunteering. And so we kind of cater to the ones that seem to be showing up, but you are contending there's a reason that we're losing the men. There's a reason the men aren't stepping up. And that's something else I was going to ask you to speak to is it's not just the decor or the music, the song selection. There's other things when it comes to the giftings that we call upon often in the church. Speak to that a little bit, where sometimes we can basically tell men, we don't really need you here. What we need is more of the feminine. So what do you say to that?
Well, that's true. A lot of the volunteer opportunities in the church have traditionally revolved around things that women have done. We have social services, caring for the sick and the poor. Music, women are more likely to men than have had music training as children. We call on people to read aloud, and men are 4 times as likely as women to have a reading disorder. So when we hand Bibles out and we say, Renee, would you look up 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 7, And John, would you look up, Zechariah 13? He may not even know where Zechariah is. Or, he may stumble. He's sitting there praying the whole time. Don't give me a verse that has a word like Nebuchadnezzar in it or something. So we actually can embarrass men because their gifting does not necessarily match what's needed in the church. So much of our church ministry is around the care of children. And women often feel much more comfortable in that role, especially in light of all the sex scandals that have come on. Any man who wants to spend time with children is now suspect, which, grieves me greatly because the boys need to be spending time with men.
Oh.
So it's a higher hurdle for a man to find men who possess these verbal relational skills that make you a good churchgoer.
Do you think that it's, there's not really a middle ground for men in the church? You're either like in charge all the way at the top level, and then there's not really a place kind of below that for a man to fit in, like you're saying with volunteer roles and things like that?
Oftentimes that's the case. There's really nothing. I mean, imagine your job is you're an HVAC installer. Where are you going to use your gifts in the church unless the air conditioning goes out? But your wife, she took piano lessons as a child. She's really good with kids. She's great with cooking for potlucks. And, all the things that she does in life or has done in life have prepared her to become a good churchgoer. Whereas the things that you're good at, reading a schematic, planning out a air conditioning system. There's not a ton of things that are necessarily attuned to what you do. This is one of the areas where mission trips, short-term mission trips, have really helped with men, because a man, if he goes on a building trip or he goes into a war zone, boy, I tell you what, the Southern Baptists have got it figured out with these chainsaw teams. The minute there's an ice storm, a tornado, or whatever, right behind that storm is teams from Southern Baptist churches, and those men are top guns. They go in there and they've got those trees bucked up in hours. They've got the power lines cleared so that the crews can come in and restore power. And these men find great joy. Why? Not because they're baking cakes for the ladies' tea, but because they are functioning within their areas of expertise. And if you think about it, the top man in the church, the pastor, right? Well, what are his gifts? Well, he's verbal, he's sensitive, he's relational, he's all the things women are. And, he's the example to the men. He loves to study. He loves books. Your average guy may not be there. Some guys are, but a lot of guys aren't. So you can see there's sort of a disconnect here. And a lot of guys would just as soon leave religion to their wives because they perceive their wives as better at it.
One thing I want to respond to, Caralee, your last question, just to make sure we're not saying this or that you're not hearing this, is when you talked about there not being middle ground. I heard you use the word like in charge, and maybe you're not saying this, so don't let me put words in your mouth, but I don't think it's a matter of if guys can't be in charge, they don't want to step up and serve. I think what it is men struggle in what we normally traditionally have offered in church to see where they fit. So it's
that's
not
kind of what I was talking
about. That's what you're saying. Okay.
You've either got like kind of the top rung that are in leadership, and then there's not really a whole lot.
Gotcha. Okay. Because to say what David is saying just in a slightly different words is, if you can offer men, if you can show them where their gifts are needed in the church, if we can show them that, look, we need those hands-on skills to build things, to fix cars, to break things down. Like if we can plug those in and show them that skill is important beyond just serving in the nursery or, singing in the worship team, like that men see that there's a place for me here and this church needs me.
That's kind of what I meant. Exactly. Like maybe creating some more opportunities in the middle ground for men to feel like they fit in, like they, have a purpose.
And the churches that are reaching men are doing exactly that. They're training men in these different skill areas and, teaching them to be good Bible study leaders. And these are roles that maybe aren't necessarily natural to them, but they can be learned over time. So yeah, there is a middle ground. Of course, we're talking about why men don't even step up and try in the first place. As so much of my work is focused on just getting that entry level, that invitation to men right. And so I'll tend to I'll put a lot of emphasis on that invitation, that front door. And so, but once a church does open that door, you'll find that men will fill the roles that are available.
David, recently I was listening to a podcast, and I can't even remember the name of it now, but where they were addressing this issue of men in the church. And, they were talking about how sometimes churches pander to the male audience in that we give them, come to this event, we'll have donuts and meat, it's like we kind of treat the men like Homer Simpson, as though they're incapable of reading or they're incapable of going deep. And I guess what I wanted to say to that is, the reason I think it's important to focus on some of these issues we've talked about already is that then we earn the right to speak to those deeper issues with men. Because when I led and pastored for years, I called men out on a regular basis. I challenged them to be readers. I challenged them to lead their family spiritually. But that only came after I had the right to speak into their life as someone who they looked to and respected and thought, well, he understands my world. He gets where I'm coming from. So they weren't hearing this effeminate man in their eyes telling them that they need to be more like their wives or that they need to be more, feminine, but they're hearing a strong masculine leader call them to a higher level of living or to call them to growth. And so I think that's where it really matters that churches pause for a moment and leaders pause and say, what does a normal man experience when he walks into our church? Like, what environment are we setting here? Because if they come in and look around and go, this is for children and old ladies, I'm out, we're never going to have that opportunity to impact them or influence them.
Yep. You've got to get the door open. You've got to, we had a different, it is really about that. The first 30 seconds, 45 seconds, men have made their decision on whether this is their place or it's a play. This is why so many men get dragged to church on Christmas and Easter. They come in and, what do they hear on Christmas? Oh, there's babies and mangers and donkeys and stars and little adorable little angel choir and children and candles. And, this is what they get. And then, on Easter, it's kind of a similar thing. It's not, the messages that they tend to get don't really stir the masculine heart. So we need to do a lot. Like you said, Jon, we need to be looking at everything through the eyes of a young man, particularly an unchurched man. And the nice thing is when you target that guy, we know from research, when you target that guy, you get the family in the deal. This was the success of, the two biggest success stories as far as growing megachurches in the 1990s was Willow Creek and Saddleback. And interestingly, both of those churches had a mythical male parishioner. There was Saddleback Sam and Unchurched Harry. And everything those churches were built to do was to get that guy comfortable enough to sit through one service.
Wow.
Because they knew if you got that guy in the door, you would get the family in the deal. And they also recognized that most churches unwittingly target women. They don't mean to, but with their ministry offerings, with the way they present the gospel, everything with their marketing, to their logos, to the decor, everything is targeting that middle-aged to older woman. And they don't do this intentionally, but these are the women who are doing the decoration. These are women who are pushing the culture of the church. And these, quite honestly, they're the women who fund the organization with their time, with their money. And so from a financial perspective, it makes much more sense in the short term to target grandma, because she's the one who's going to be there at the potluck. She's that reliable Christian. Why on earth would you want to target men? They're really squishy. They show up, sometimes they don't, blah, blah, blah. You target them for the long-term health of the church because Jesus targeted men. You'll recall the early church, right? Jesus called 6 women, 6 men, and he started a children's ministry. No, he didn't. He went out and found 12 guys. And so I think Jesus was telling us something when you target men as your initial, what you're going for, what you're fishing for, fishers of men, you will get the entire church in the deal. But if you target women and children, your church will eventually weaken and die.
And studies show that, right? In the instances where dad comes, we get the family, but when it's just mom, don't those numbers significantly drop off when it's just mom bringing the kids to church?
Talk to your youth leader and ask him, who are your most involved kids? And then do they have the involved dads? Almost without exception, they will have fathers who are walking closely with Jesus. The most disengaged kids are going to be the ones that are dragged by their moms, or there's unequally yoked couple. And as the father goes, so go the children. It's been that way since the Old Testament, and it's still true today. That the kids tend to follow their father's examples in spiritual things.
And again, I just want to reiterate for our audience, this is not to diminish the role of a mother, especially that single mom or that mom who's coming to church faithfully without her, husband who's following the Lord, or, he's not in the picture. But it's speaking to the power of a father's role in his son or daughter's life. And we can't ignore that as a church. Like, just because it may not be politically correct or whatever, like, we have to look at that and engage that. So David, I just have one more big question, and then I'll turn it back over to Caralee. But and this is broad, you can go anywhere you want with this question, but if there's a pastor listening to this that is like, okay, I probably need to do an audit on things, like what advice would you give them? What are some get started here, some practical steps that pastor can take to start leading in this direction of being a church that men don't hate coming to?
Okay, well, you could follow the example of Jesus by fashioning a whip and go, no.
Yes, I love that. What's step 2? Hold on, I'm writing this down.
And you fashion a whip and you overturn the missions fundraising table. And
this is going to be awesome. I can't wait for Sunday. Let's go. No.
This is advice not to take. Okay.
Oh,
I thought we needed a little laugh. Well, you know what? You could one of the things I've actually heard is instead of making this a man versus women thing, you could go to a couple of key women in the church, maybe whose husbands don't attend or whose boys they're worried about their sons, and just call them together and say, we'd like to put a bigger emphasis on men, not to exclude women or to marginalize women, but because we recognize that we need more men and more male involvement. You women are carrying the load around here and you need help. And I think when you phrase it that way, when the women understand they're not being pushed aside, but we're trying to recruit, most women will agree with that as a strategy. So one of the best things you could do would be to get those women on your side first. And then I think you could say most women have the decorating gene. And you could say, what do you say we do some redecorating here? Let's go full Chip and Jo here. Let's make this place a place that is welcoming to both men and women. And so decor would be one of the things that you could do. As a pastor, you could certainly start preaching sermons and sermon series with titles that would entice men. Let's talk about the 3 things are money, sex, and power. That's how men define themselves. Start addressing those things with your sermons. There's certainly plenty of great biblical content surrounding those 3 topics. The graphics that you put out for your sermon, instead of flowers and whatnot, it's mountains, it's hiking, it's, the things that men are into. There's a million small ways that you can do this to just telegraph to your men that they are important. And I'll tell you one thing that's also very important. When Father's Day comes around, a couple things you're going to know. First of all, Father's Day is the least attended service of the year.
Interesting.
So I wouldn't honor my men on Father's Day. I'd honor them on Mother's Day. Because that's when the men have been dragged to the church. The 3 big drag days are Christmas, Easter, and Mother's Day. That's when
you just blew my mind with this. So hold on, I'm processing. So we have Mother's Day, and you're saying honor the fathers on Mother's Day.
Yeah, there are sneaky ways to do that. I worked with a church in Richland, Washington called Bethel Church, and they did the most clever thing. I just really admire. On Father's Day, they honored the family instead of just honoring mom, giving her a flower. And they had a great object lesson. They had a scissor lift up front, and they had a family. They had a family, a mother and 2 kids, and then the man joined them and he operated it. And the idea is when the man is present, leading spiritually, he lifts his entire family. And so this family went up. And then he would give different examples of things, where families were dysfunctional and the lift would go down and then the lift would go up. And he was actually praising men on Mother's Day.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, the church just exploded. They loved that sermon because he explained it to the women in terms of what the benefit is to you, women, when men are following Jesus. Mothers are the ones who reap the benefits. And so just a really clever way of portraying that. So yeah, even on Mother's Day, you can honor your men and don't beat up your men on Father's Day. I've been to a lot of Father's Day services where the pastor is just savaging the men. Why are you such a failure? And why aren't you, it's just awful. If you're going to preach on Father's Day, there won't be many people in the room, but at least honor the men that are there.
Yeah, for sure.
Good.
I have one more question. Okay, so you're doing all these things. You're, getting men involved, interested, back into the church. What does it look like from there? How are you as a church taking care of them spiritually, so that they do become, go from just attending to really becoming leaders in their household, in a real relationship with Christ?
Great question, Caralee. Once the men are in the house, it's important to disciple them. And what I believe that God sends most churches 2 or 3 men's champions. And the pastor, as a pastor, you need to be aware and open to these guys. They're going to come to you and they're going to say things like, we really need to do a thing for men, or we need to do men's ministry. So you need to point them in the direction of a good video curriculum, such as 33 or K21, or there's several of them out there that are very solid biblically. Get them together regularly, either by Zoom or in person, and just start teaching them basic manhood concepts. And that can be everything like how to be responsible with your money, how to be a good dad, how to handle discipline issues. And we just have an embarrassment of riches right now of really good men's content that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. So pastors, take advantage of that champion. When he comes to you, don't blow him off, empower him, but make sure that his teaching comes from a reliable curriculum, because there is a tendency, sometimes a man will kind of go off, he'll want to teach some crazy or get some political thing going, and don't let him go down that road. Make sure he stays focused on discipling of men, making them better husbands, fathers, more honest, better in business, that sort of thing.
That's great. That's great.
That's good. I would just point out in that vein, David, that any man that is not willing to be under authority and submit to authority is not a good leader, is a dangerous leader, and so that whoever that champion of men is in the church needs to be a man under authority himself, because that he'll be a much safer leader. So that's a good word there.
Well, this has been so informative and just great information. I'm with you guys. I think, men play such a vital and important role in the church. And especially, in our households as well. So I'm glad that we had this conversation today. David, we'd love to wrap up our podcast with a question. Is there any word of hope, encouragement, or advice that you could give to the pastors listening today, or even the men that are listening today?
Well, pastors, don't focus on what you're doing wrong regarding men. Focus on what you're doing right. And, if you're preaching faithfully from God's word, if you're preaching hard-hitting and concise messages that aren't too long, because men tend to have a little bit shorter attention span than women, do that, continue doing that. And then just be open to be looking for that champion and, set him free to do what he needs to do. If there's a men's event coming to your church, you need to be at it. Your presence will be so important. You need to be pushing it from the pulpit. Amazingly, a lot of pastors don't do that. So I encourage you to be a strong proponent of ministry to men within your church. And here's the funny thing you're going to find: as you grow your men, your church will grow. So just continue down that path. It's a difficult path. It's anybody can build a church full of women and children, but it takes a true evangelist to grow a church with growing men. And I would just encourage you to keep going down that path if you are on that path. And if you're not, come visit me at davidmurrow.com, and I'd be happy to help you with whatever resources I can.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, David.
Yes, my pleasure. Thanks for hanging out with a couple of guys on this one.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.